What did Donald Trump do today? April 22, 2025 recap. The White House posted an article titled, "On Earth Day, we finally have a president who follows science," which serves less as a substantive environmental policy statement and more as a politicized propaganda piece aimed at reinforcing partisan grievances rather than outlining credible environmental leadership. Although it claims to champion science-based policies, the piece relies heavily on culture war rhetoric, cherry-picked data, and misleading contrasts with prior administrations. Its opening assertion that America has the cleanest air and water in the world under President Trump is not only hyperbolic but factually questionable. While the United States has made progress on pollution control since the 1970s, several independent studies place the nation behind many European countries in key environmental health metrics. More importantly, Trump-era policies, marked by the rollback of methane emissions standards, weakened fuel efficiency requirements, and loosened power plant regulations, undermine this claim. The article's portrayal of Trump as a champion of energy innovation rests on selective examples like carbon capture technology and nuclear energy, while conveniently omitting the administration's broader antagonism toward renewable energy sources such as wind and solar. Carbon capture remains largely experimental and has not achieved the scale necessary to justify continued fossil fuel expansion, particularly the administration's push to increase liquefied natural gas exports. Similarly, the section on forest management parrots timber industry talking points, framing expanded logging as environmental stewardship without grappling with the climate-driven factors that exacerbate wildfire risks. The administration's policy leans toward deregulation and commercial exploitation of public lands rather than addressing underlying ecological vulnerabilities. Perhaps the most revealing indicator of the article's unserious approach to environmental policy is its focus on paper straws. Rather than engaging with the significant global crisis of plastic pollution, the piece reduces environmental debate to a culture war grievance, seizing on isolated reports about PFAS chemicals in paper straws while ignoring the Trump administration's broader inaction on regulating PFAS contamination. The article's defense of environmental deregulation, such as pausing emissions rules for coal plants and weakening the National Environmental Policy Act, is similarly misleading. Independent assessments have found that these rollbacks expedited energy and infrastructure projects at the expense of comprehensive environmental review, undermining the claim that they maintained rigorous environmental standards. The piece's praise for expanding oil, gas, and mineral extraction on federal lands under the guise of energy security glosses over the long-term environmental costs of such policies, including habitat destruction, groundwater contamination, and increased greenhouse gas emissions. Its mention of $38 billion in clean water infrastructure spending during Trump's first term lacks meaningful context, as if this investment alone compensates for the broader dismantling of environmental protections. The criticism of foreign nations like Brazil, China, and Mexico for environmental degradation may contain elements of truth, but the Trump administration's withdrawal from international environmental agreements such as the Paris Climate Accord and its weakening of domestic enforcement mechanisms undermine any credible claim to global leadership on environmental stewardship. Finally, the article's assertion that Trump is protecting wildlife by pausing certain wind projects leans on an argument often weaponized by fossil fuel interests to discredit renewable energy. While it is true that wind turbines can impact bird populations, the far greater threats to biodiversity remain habitat loss, pollution, and climate change, issues exacerbated by the very fossil fuel policies the administration promotes. Overall, the article presents a hollow and cynical narrative that cloaks deregulatory, extractive, and protectionist policies in the language of science and environmentalism. Far from reflecting a genuine commitment to scientific stewardship, it exemplifies the Trump administration's pattern of using environmental issues as a stage for ideological posturing rather than serious policy engagement. Source: White House Briefing Room. Vice President JD Vance gave remarks in Jaipur, India, during the Ananta Center's India-US Forum. His speech served as a revealing example of the Trump administration's continued use of foreign policy platforms to advance domestic ideological narratives rather than focus on substantive diplomacy. Although framed as a celebration of the partnership between India and the United States, The speech repeatedly drifted into campaign-style rhetoric, leaning heavily on grievance politics, populist nostalgia and transactional economics. Rather than centering India as an equal and vital partner, Vance used the occasion to attack Western leadership elites, environmental policies and globalization, portraying these as threats to national pride and industrial strength. His repeated caricature of Western policymakers as driven by self-doubt, fear of the future and hostility toward growth reduced complex policy debates, particularly on energy and climate change, to strawman arguments and lazy sloganeering. The speech substituted thoughtful engagement on global challenges with blunt assertions like, "Drill, baby, drill," offering more culture war rhetoric than serious economic or diplomatic strategy. Despite claiming to reject the condescension of previous U.S. administrations toward India, Vance's remarks often fell into their own form of paternalism, suggesting that India's success is largely validated by its alignment with Trump's ideological vision of nationalist growth and energy dominance. This contradiction is particularly evident in his critique of past globalism while promoting American military hardware, natural gas, ethanol and nuclear technology to India. The speech's transactional focus became especially transparent when Vance plainly stated the administration's desire for India to buy more of our military equipment, framing partnership in the language of commerce and arms sales rather than shared democratic values or strategic cooperation. While trade and defense deals are natural components of such bilateral relationships, the aggressive sales pitch tone undermines the credibility of his calls for genuine partnership. Vance's extensive personal anecdotes, particularly about his upbringing in Middletown, Ohio, his family history and his children's rapport with Prime Minister Modi, occupy an outsized portion of the address, diluting its diplomatic substance. While personal stories can humanize a speaker and forge connections, here they come across as self-indulgent, at times trivializing the seriousness of the occasion. His odd suggestion that his children's affection for Modi reflects the Prime Minister's leadership quality borders on the unserious, reducing high-stakes diplomacy to personal chemistry and family charm rather than policy alignment or strategic foresight. The speech's lack of policy depth is another glaring issue. Although Vance referenced progress on trade negotiations and defense cooperation, these mentions remain vague and largely aspirational. He cited the finalization of terms of reference for trade talks and touts various joint initiatives, but offered little clarity on measurable objectives, enforcement mechanisms, or detailed plans for implementation. Instead, the speech leaned on broad promises and rhetorical flourishes about building a bright new world, leaving the audience without a clear sense of how these lofty ambitions will be realized. Moreover, the overall tone of the remarks undermined potential soft power gains. Rather than emphasizing shared democratic values, cultural exchange or mutual learning, Vance's speech was dominated by hostility toward global environmental agreements, derision of multilateralism and scorn for climate-conscious policies. By framing global cooperation as a battleground between proud nationalists and fearful globalists, the vice president missed the opportunity to offer a unifying vision. This confrontational approach risks alienating broader audiences in India and elsewhere who do not share these ideological fixations. While Vance gestured toward partnership and shared prosperity, the speech read less like a statesman's blueprint for the future and more like a campaign stump speech repurposed for an international audience. The repeated emphasis on Trump's leadership, combined with attacks on prior administrations and ideological opponents, rendered the address a showcase of domestic political messaging rather than a serious articulation of U.S.-India cooperation. What could have been a moment to reinforce trust, mutual respect and common purpose between two of the world's largest democracies instead becomes an awkward blend of self-congratulation, salesmanship and ideological posturing. Source: The White House. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt held a briefing that exemplifies the Trump administration's continued use of hyperpartisan rhetoric, selective statistics, and emotionally charged framing designed more to reinforce campaign talking points than to provide meaningful policy updates. Throughout the briefing, Leavitt delivers government communications in a tone that blurs the distinction between official statements and campaign propaganda, a strategy that has become a defining feature of this administration's approach to the press. The opening acknowledgement of Pope Francis's death is brief and formulaic, with Leavitt quickly pivoting to logistical details about President Trump's travel plans rather than offering any substantive reflection on the Pope's legacy. The failure to engage meaningfully with the Pope's long-standing advocacy for peace, poverty reduction, and human rights underscores the transactional nature of this administration's diplomacy, where ceremonial gestures replace serious engagement with moral leadership on the global stage. The most troubling section of the briefing lies in Leavitt's discussion of border policy, where the language veers into dehumanizing rhetoric with repeated references to illegal criminal invaders. This framing is not only inflammatory but also fundamentally misleading, reducing a complex issue of migration, asylum law, and international human rights obligations to a simplistic narrative of criminality. The statistics she cites about drops in border crossings and catch-and-release rates are presented without proper context, failing to acknowledge the legal limitations on deportations, the role of due process, or the impact of federal court rulings that have constrained many of the administration's harsher immigration tactics. Similarly, the administration's stance on student loan collections is framed in punitive terms, casting the issue as one of personal irresponsibility rather than addressing broader systemic failures such as soaring tuition costs and exploitative lending practices. Leavitt's insistence that debt cannot be wiped away oversimplifies ongoing legal debates about executive authority under the Higher Education Act and ignores the economic consequences of aggressive collection measures on millions of struggling borrowers. The emphasis on wage garnishment, tax refund seizure, and pension withholding reflects a carceral approach to debt rather than any serious effort to reform higher education financing. On economic policy, Leavitt's boasts about foreign investment, such as the claim that a Swiss pharmaceutical company will invest $50 billion in the United States, are presented without independent verification. These assertions lack critical details, such as whether these investments were already planned or contingent on future agreements, and therefore read more as political posturing than credible economic reporting. Her repetition of slogans like Trump's speed adds a layer of branding but no substance to the discussion of trade negotiations, which remain vague regarding concrete achievements. In addressing management at the Pentagon, Leavitt again defaults to scapegoating, blaming so-called leakers for internal dissent rather than addressing legitimate concerns about leadership and personnel decisions. The administration's reflexive vilification of whistleblowers and internal critics reinforces its broader hostility toward transparency and accountability. This dynamic also plays out in the administration's media strategy, where Leavitt's warm welcome of YouTuber Tim Pool stands in stark contrast to her consistent antagonism toward traditional press outlets. Rather than challenging Pool's accusations of media disinformation, Leavitt affirms his narrative, signaling the administration's preference for ideologically aligned voices over independent journalism. The discussion of Schedule F reclassifications and civil service purges continues this theme of loyalty enforcement under the guise of accountability. Leavitt frames the policy as common sense, suggesting that federal employees who do not advance the president's agenda should simply go find another job. This rhetoric dangerously conflates partisan loyalty with legal and ethical public service, undermining the apolitical tradition of the civil service and raising legitimate concerns about government stability and institutional integrity. Leavitt's comments on trade policy, particularly with China, remain frustratingly vague. Phrases like setting the stage for a deal are repeated without offering specifics on progress, objectives, or the terms under negotiation. This lack of clarity suggests either a strategic opacity meant to shield the administration from accountability or, more likely, a lack of substantive movement on these critical issues. The same lack of detail plagues the administration's contradictory public health messaging, where Leavitt avoids addressing the inconsistency between the decision to pull back a menthol cigarette ban while moving forward with a proposed ban on food dyes. On foreign policy, Leavitt provides few concrete insights into the Trump administration's strategy regarding the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Iran negotiations, or upcoming diplomatic visits. The briefing's repeated claims that the president wants peace are unaccompanied by any tangible benchmarks for success or evidence of effective diplomacy. This vague reassurance does little to clarify the administration's role as a serious negotiator in these international arenas. Finally, Leavitt's handling of ongoing litigation with Harvard University over federal funding again reveals the administration's preference for coercion over dialogue. Her assertion that Harvard has put themselves in the position to lose their own funding reduces a complex legal and constitutional dispute to a simplistic narrative of lawbreaking and punishment. This framing ignores legitimate concerns about academic freedom, government overreach, and the broader implications of using federal funding as leverage to enforce ideological conformity. Throughout the briefing, Leavitt's communication style reflects a consistent strategy of oversimplification, demonization of opponents, and refusal to engage with substantive counterarguments. This approach diminishes the credibility of the White House press office as an institution meant to inform the public and foster accountability. Rather than offering serious policy briefings, Leavitt functions primarily as a political advocate, delivering talking points designed to inflame rather than enlighten. Source: The White House. A federal judge has issued a preliminary injunction blocking the Trump administration from dismantling Voice of America and its affiliated government-funded news outlets, at least temporarily, marking a significant setback for Trump's efforts to halt these broadcasters. The ruling, issued by Judge Roy C. Lamberth, restores VOA employees, contractors, and staff at Radio Free Asia and Middle East broadcasting networks to their positions prior to Trump's March 14 executive order, which had suspended their work. Lamberth sharply criticized the administration's actions as arbitrary and capricious, noting the absence of any serious analysis or justification, and suggested the administration likely violated multiple federal laws. The Trump administration argued that halting all journalism activities did not infringe on individual First Amendment rights, a defense Lamberth called troubling. Unions and journalist groups celebrated the decision, with VOA's White House bureau chief, Patsy Widakuswara, calling the ruling vital for journalistic freedom and national security, warning that prolonged shutdowns allow adversaries to spread disinformation unchecked. Since the March suspension, over 1,000 employees and contractors have been placed on leave, offices have been locked and broadcasts have been halted, an unprecedented move for VOA, which has operated continuously since World War II. The Trump administration justified the order as part of an effort to cut federal spending on what it labeled frivolous expenditures. The case stems from lawsuits filed by VOA employees against the administration and its advisor, Kari Lake, who oversees the U.S. Agency for Global Media. The administration claimed the move was a temporary pause, not a shutdown, but the judge dismissed this reasoning as inadequate, arguing it stranded 1,300 employees while the president tries to make up his mind. The injunction does not cover Radio Free Europe/Radio Liberty or the Open Technology Fund, although RFE/RL has separately secured a temporary bar against its shutdown. However, RFE/RL remains at risk due to stalled grant disbursements, with Judge Lamberth cautioning that if negotiations fail, the court may intervene to prevent further damage. Overall, the ruling represents a judicial pushback against executive overreach, defending both the legal protections for federally funded journalism and the constitutional principles of free speech and press independence.
Source: NPR.
More than 150 university and college presidents have signed a joint letter condemning the Trump administration's recent attempts to use federal funding as leverage to control the policies of private higher education institutions. The letter, organized by the American Association of Colleges and Universities, criticizes what it calls unprecedented government overreach and warns against political interference in university operations. While the signers say they are open to legitimate government oversight and constructive reform, they reject the coercive use of federal research funding to enforce political demands. The conflict escalated after the Trump administration paused billions in federal grants to several top universities, including Harvard, Columbia, Princeton, and the University of Pennsylvania, as part of its broader campaign to combat anti-Semitism on campuses. These demands included changes to admissions processes, penalties for student protesters, and new oversight policies. Columbia complied with the administration's conditions, leading to public backlash and the resignation of its interim president, Katrina A. Armstrong. Harvard, however, refused to comply and instead filed a lawsuit seeking to block the administration's termination of $2.2 billion in federal funding. The letter also criticizes the administration's crackdown on international students, highlighting the revocation of hundreds of student visas, particularly targeting Middle Eastern students and participants in pro-Palestinian protests. In response to the letter, a White House spokesperson dismissed the signatories as overpaid blowhards and defended the administration's actions as standing up for equality and fairness. Source: NBC News. The Trump administration has fired at least 8 immigration judges across Massachusetts, California, and Louisiana as part of its ongoing push to downsize the federal government and accelerate immigration enforcement. These judges, at the end of their 2-year probationary period with the Executive Office for Immigration Review (EIR), were not given reasons for their termination. This latest wave of dismissals adds to the over 100 immigration court staff and more than 24 judges who have already been laid off or resigned since Trump's second term began. The firings come amid growing concerns that the administration is undermining due process for migrants, especially following Trump's recent public remarks suggesting mass deportations without individual trials, claiming the judicial system could not handle the volume. About 700 immigration judges handle nearly 4 million pending cases, including 1.5 million asylum claims, but fiscal year 2024 saw only around 666,000 initial case decisions. Critics, including Matt Biggs, president of the Judges Union, argue that firing judges worsens the backlog rather than alleviating it. A group of 13 previously terminated judges has filed a class appeal, asserting their dismissals violated civil service protections. Meanwhile, an April memo from EIR leadership instructed judges to dismiss weak asylum claims without hearings, a move seen as further eroding procedural fairness. Legal experts and advocates warn that these actions reflect a broader strategy of weakening the immigration court system while ramping up deportations, effectively sidelining the judiciary in favor of administrative speed.
Source: KUNR.
Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison has filed a lawsuit against President Trump and U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi after the Trump administration threatened to cut federal funding to Minnesota over the state's refusal to enforce Trump's executive order banning transgender athletes from competing in girls' and women's sports. The administration argues that Title IX prohibits transgender participation in these sports, directly opposing the Biden administration's previous stance. Ellison denounced the order as unconstitutional and discriminatory, asserting that both the U.S. Constitution and Title IX protect gender identity. He emphasized that Minnesota would not comply with what he called shameful bullying. The lawsuit, filed in Minnesota District Court, also challenges Trump's broader executive action that defines sex strictly as male or female and blocks federal funds from supporting what the administration calls gender ideology. Ellison argued that the administration's directives, including letters from Bondi and Assistant Attorney General Harmeet Dillon demanding that Minnesota enforce the ban, violate the Administrative Procedure Act for being arbitrary and capricious. He maintained that these actions conflict with both federal and Minnesota law, particularly the Minnesota Human Rights Act, which explicitly protects against discrimination based on gender identity. This lawsuit is one of several legal challenges Ellison and other Democratic attorneys general are pursuing against Trump's executive orders targeting transgender rights. Another pending case involves an order to cut funding for gender-affirming care for trans youth, which is currently under a temporary injunction by federal courts. At the press conference announcing the lawsuit, Minnesota State Representative Lee Finca, the state's first openly transgender lawmaker, condemned the Trump administration's actions as part of a larger assault on trans rights. Finca and Ellison framed the legal challenge as a defense of inclusion, dignity, and legal protections for transgender individuals in Minnesota. Source: The Hill. The Supreme Court, in a narrow 5-4 decision, ruled that immigrants who agree to voluntarily leave the U.S. are entitled to deadline flexibility if their departure deadline falls on a weekend or legal holiday. The case involved Hugo Abasai Monsalvo Velasquez, a Mexican national who came to the U.S. as a teenager and lived in Colorado for nearly 20 years before being ordered to leave in 2021. His 60-day self-deportation deadline fell on a Saturday, but he filed a motion to reopen his case late on the preceding Friday, with the filing officially docketed the following Monday. Writing for the majority, Justice Neil Gorsuch argued that, as with other legal deadlines, the term days should extend such deadlines to the next business day. Chief Justice John Roberts and the court's 3 liberal justices joined the opinion. The 4 other conservative justices dissented, with Justice Samuel Alito criticizing the ruling as an improper 2-day extension and contending that the case should have been returned to a lower court to assess jurisdiction. Alito stressed that the law sets firm deadlines and that exceptions, even by a day, undermine those rules. Monsalvo Velasquez, who had built a life in the Denver area with his wife and 2 children and had recently opened a business, now avoids the harsh penalties typically imposed on those who miss voluntary departure deadlines, such as long-term bans on reentry and ineligibility for relief. The ruling reflects one of several immigration-related cases before the court amid Trump's broader crackdown on immigration. Source: Associated Press.